Listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dave Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar program, Validating and Accelerating UI/UX Improvements with Software Usage Data. Before we get started, I have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. Today's presentation will be followed by a live Q&A, so at any point during the presentation, you can ask a question by going to your control panel, opening up the questions tab, typing it in, hitting submit, and we will answer as many as time allows before the program ends. Secondly, today's webinar is going to be available on demand on the sdtimes.com website in about a day, so you can listen to it again, share it with your friends, play it as many times as you wish. All right, so we've been writing quite a lot in SD Times on the subject of UI/UX, how important it is to keep design top of mind through the development process, and how UIs are changing and evolving to include such things as chatbots and AI. But even with all that, companies still find that users are moving to other applications and websites and abandoning shopping carts and going elsewhere. What organizations need today are analytics that tell them exactly how users are interacting with the applications and websites, so what they create is what the users will use. Here to discuss this further is Keith Fennick. He's the Vice President of Software Usage Analytics at a company called Revulytics. He co-founded a company called Trackbird Software Analytics before it was acquired by Revulytics in 2016. And now to get things started, I'm going to turn it over to Keith.
Thank you very much, David, and hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. So, during this webinar, before we get started, I just want to give you a brief overview of who we are and kind of what makes us in position to discuss this topic. As David was mentioning, Revulytics deals with usage intelligence, and our business deals with both compliance analytics as well as usage analytics. The difference is compliance analytics is about detecting piracy and being able to turn this intelligence into revenue for customers, whilst the usage analytics part of our business deals with tracking and analyzing product usage and usage behavior for people who are using your software. So getting straight into it, the topics we'll be discussing today will be around user experience design, UI design, and how software usage analytics can help you in building the UI of your product or enhancing the UI of your product. We will be looking at a few case studies about software usage analytics, where we'll be looking at how we can validate user environments. We'll look into cases where you can measure or predict the impact of UI changes on your user behavior when dealing with your product. And we'll also be having a look at how usage intelligence or usage analytics can help you when doing A/B testing and in your iterative design. We'll also have a little chat about how you can use the quantitative data from software usage analytics and beef it up with qualitative data from, for example, surveys or one-to-one customer interaction. And before we close, I also want to have a little overview of a particular customer case we had, who managed to use software usage intelligence to accelerate the adoption of a new version out there, and they did this very successfully and saved, hundreds of thousands of dollars in doing so. So I'll be talking about this case as an example. So before we jump into that, I just wanted to ask the audience, what is your primary role in the organization? This will help me know who is out there in the audience, and it will help me modify the webinar accordingly. So you can answer whether you're in the product development or engineering stage, or the engineering role, whether you're in product management or UI/UX specialist, or any others. So David, can you please run the poll and let us know?
Okay, we're running the poll. Guess folks have still just a few more seconds to put in their answers. All right. Okay, the poll is still in progress, but just to give you an idea, Keith, 24% of our attendees are UI UX specialists. 18% are in product development, 18% are in product management, and now 39% claim to be other. So
okay, so we have a very interesting mix today. So yeah, that's great. So let's go ahead and start this. So when looking into the user experience journey, keep in mind that the user experience journey actually starts when the user makes the first contact with your company. Now, this can be maybe via your company website or landing page, and it also spans across the whole evaluation lifecycle, using your customer support material, adopting your software as a paid customer going forward, talking to your sales reps or support people. So the user experience journey encapsulates everything that the user experiences when dealing with your company or your product. Therefore, it is crucial that you do not you take good care of your user experience design at each stage in the life cycle. And one of the most effective ways of doing this is by observing how the user is interacting with the various elements. And when looking into the product itself, we'll be focusing on the UI part of the product, right? Because that has a crucial impact on how customers behave and how customers use your product. You will be surprised how even a minor update in the UI can lead to a drastic change in the user behavior. And as a result, it can have an impact on your conversions, on your retention, on your customer satisfaction. And, for example, out there has been numerous cases published. So one of the most interesting ones I came across is from Paul Ray, who was the user experience manager for Bing, Microsoft's search engine. And they actually claimed that the particular shade of blue for Bing, there's a very, very important reason why that was chosen. Like literally the hex color 0044CC was chosen over other hues because it amounted to an additional $80 million in annual revenue for Microsoft when one factors in the additional clicks and on the advertisement and increased user engagement. So literally they did a number of tests with different colors, different hues of literally different types of blue, and that particular color resulted in much more user interaction. So, just a very simple thing like a color of a button or a link can have huge impact on how people react to it. And this is not just one case. I mean, there's another case from I was reading about was from ESPN.com, which is which practically what they did is the senior VP of digital media was saying that they literally listened to their customers, to their community, ran surveys, etc., and incorporated all the suggestions from their community into their homepage redesign. And this guy, like John Costner, who's the senior VP, actually claimed that by doing so and simply not offering anything different, they just how they were presenting things to users based on their community feedback, made their revenues jump by around 35% in a single year. So, you can see that although these are cases related to online, web, whatever, you can very easily appreciate that simple redesign of a UI can have huge impact on what people do with your software or how they react to it. So for the sake of this webinar, we will be focusing on the user experience component inside your product. And as you know, the aim behind any user experience design is to support the user throughout their evaluation and usage of the product. So how do we achieve this from the UI aspect? If you look at some basic user experience goals that you need to keep in mind, and this is also something that usage intelligence can come in handy, okay, when trying to define these goals, is if we want to start, we can start with the most basic, right, which is building the product around your user. So you need to make sure that you know who the user is and what they want to do with your product. Now, knowing this will allow you to provide guidance throughout whatever workflow the user is trying to go through. But at the same time, you need to let the user stay in control so that they do not get frustrated because they cannot achieve what they are trying to do, right? So build a product around what they're trying to do and make sure you provide them easy navigation around that workflow. So help the user help the user flow through the process within your software. Now depends on whatever your software does and deliver, obviously, and realize that a totally new user might take a different path than an experienced user. So you need to cater for both personas. Now, at any point in time, it's really good to guide the user. So once you have defined the workflow that you want to push them through, keep in mind that you have different personas attempting to achieve different tasks with the same software. So you might want to design different paths throughout your workflow to target these personas. At any stage, always try to set the focal point in your software to the most important controls. And this will help you, it will help the user really focus on what matters most. So irrespective of how complicated your software may be or you think it may be, eliminating all the noise and having a simple UI is appreciated by all users. And this goes across the board, it goes across different industries. Kind of simplicity is key, as I will explain to you in the case study that we'll be publishing soon from a particular customer. This is a very, very complex software, but they went for a simple UI that really created much better user engagement. And if you think about what is noise, I mean, the simple answer to that is to not have several UI components that are competing for the user's attention. So anything that is not within the immediate workflow for the user, that can be considered noise. So remove that, take it away, put it on the side somewhere, and allow the user to focus on the most important things. Now, before we go on, let's make sure we are all on the same page when talking about software usage intelligence or software usage analytics. Usage intelligence solutions are typically integrated into your product, and they are integrated because they need to track what users do with your software after they actually download it and install it. So if you look at software usage analytics, you can break it down in 3 different components. You have the tracking component that usually happens via a call home system, and that typically is the component that collects raw data about user actions. Then you have the visualization component, which helps you analyze the data and find out about user trends, user behavior. For example, you can see the differentiators across the different user segments, because as we said earlier, you might have different user personas. So if you group them up in user segments, they might be using your software for different workflows or also different goals. And then if you look at the last part, this is the actionable component, which is the part that helps you build a more context-relevant engagement process. So this can consist, for example, of pushing in-app messages to educate users about your product or the product functions, or pushing some form of messaging or help to promote your features. Or you can use the feedback collection mechanisms, like you can collect personalized feedback within the product, such as doing A/B testing in an iterative development process. So overall, usage intelligence gives you a vision on the user's journey, both during the evaluation, when they're still discovering your product and its features, and throughout their life cycle, every time they interact with your software. So looking at usage intelligence solution from an architectural perspective, you can see that on the left here you have the end users that are running your software. These are feeding data into an analytics engine via some call home system. This is typically running as a cloud service. Okay, so they do call homes, all the raw data sent to the cloud service, all the number crunching happens in the analytics engine, and then you get presented with a usage intelligence dashboard that provides you reports that can analyze trends and user behavior. Okay, so the very, very important thing to keep in mind here is that raw data by itself cannot give you vision into what's happening on the user base, because raw data can be very tough to consume. So the important layer here is the middle layer, which is the data analytics engine, right, which transforms raw data into actionable reporting. So at this stage, I just want to run another poll, which is for us to determine whether you guys and girls out there are actually using automated collection through usage analytics already, or how else you get feedback when you're in the process of launching some UI change or a new feature. So do you rely on sample customers, a sample set of customers? Do you run automated usage analytics, or do you talk to internal stakeholders, or maybe you do nothing of this and you just design the product in-house and just throw it out there? So David, let us know when we have some results on this, please.
Absolutely. Okay. We are at only about 50% of the attendees have voted at this point, so we'll give them a little more time to weigh in. So we have a meaningful sample. All right. Okay, very good. Still voting. The early leader is internal stakeholders, seems to be what most people are using for feedback, followed up by a select sample of customers, and then tied at 6% each is automatic collection through usage analytics, and none, we trust our team. So that's what it looks like.
That's great. Thank you, David. So quite surprising to see that still a number of people are not relying on automated data collection. I see that a good sample are using the customer base, so collecting feedback from customers. Now there are various ways of doing that. Maybe it's one-to-one, maybe it's going through the channel. So kind of that one of the customers are obviously a great way of collecting data from to see how you're going to proceed. However, one of the biggest pain points is how to cover your whole customer base in a way that scales. Okay, so one of the main problems is reaching out to everyone, and that can be quite an expensive and time-consuming task. So what I want to focus on now in some of these case studies is how the implementation of usage intelligence, that is the automated collection of metrics from within your product, can help you in your UI or user experience design goals. Okay, so let's start with the validation of a user environment. So let's say, for example, one of your engineering team was at a conference, they heard about this new technology, they came back to the office all excited and trying to convince everyone that we should start using this new technology for our next release. But how do you actually validate whether your customers are equipped to use such a technology? It could be, for example, that the majority of your customer base are lazy adopters. So the industry trends you are reading about online or the ones that you've heard in a conference do not really match the reality within your customer base. Now, this can be a very simple decision, such as, should we support the new 4K displays? Or something like, should we switch to the latest .NET framework in the next release? Before taking such decisions, you need to be asking yourself, how many people have adopted these technologies already? And how do we know that we would not be wasting our time developing support for something that maybe is only being used by 10% of our users? This is where usage intelligence can help, because it can help you define the boundaries of what you are able to do at this time. And also, it can validate the population size that will be impacted by such a decision. With usage intelligence, you can see the trends and adoption rates. So you will know, for example, when is the right time to start migrating to a new platform. You can also use predictive analytics, because once you have a sample set of users and you can see the trends, you can calculate where the trend will be in 3 to 6 months' time. So let's say, for example, you have a 4-month development cycle to launch or to switch to the latest .NET version or to support something. If you know that you have 4 months to release, then you can look at the existing trends and see where your users will be in 4 months' time by using some basic predictive analytics, just looking at the trends, plotting the charts, and see where your customer base will be. So when the user experience designer comes up with this awesome new interface that requires a minimum resolution of, say, 1920, you will know when this new interface should be added into the roadmap, right? Because if you can see, like, from even just basic reports, you will be able to see how many people have what monitors, what resolutions, etc. at this point in time. So here are a few examples of some very simple reports that give us a ton of information if we are trying to decide what user environments we can target. So I pulled these out from a sample product within Reviolytics. And here you can see, for example, when is it safe to assume that the majority of customers will be on the latest operating system. In this case, we can see that it typically takes our customer base around 12 months for 80% of them to be on the latest operating system. And this can be used as information. So using the report here, you can see how many people are still running the older operating system versions, for example, to see when it is safe to fully focus on the new OS and stop supporting the older versions. Because as you know, supporting older versions or legacy functionality sometimes can be very painful for the engineering team. So in the case of a UI improvement, for example, let's say the one that I mentioned earlier, where you need to go to a minimum resolution, we can use the report below to see how many of the people meet this minimum requirement. How many of them have a dual monitor, for example? If the decision is when to switch to the newer .NET framework, then we have a specific report here that's showing us the number of installations we have that do not yet have this framework installed. And always keep in mind that, most of the time, the 80-20 rule rules, right? I mean, a number of times, 80% of the revenue comes from, a small sample set of our customers, which is typically 20-30%. So if you can further investigate who will actually benefit, for example, let's say you can segment between home users or business edition users, you will be in a position to determine how such changes will affect the portion of customers that are generating most income from your company. Because if this decision is going to affect revenue, or you're trying to decide to change something to increase your revenue within your company or to remain competitive, then it's very important to know that where your revenue is coming from. Now, as another example, any decision you take related to your product UI will have an impact on your user base, right? I guess nobody can argue with that. Now, hopefully your impact is a positive one, where the overall benefit would outweigh any cons of that decision. Now, usage intelligence will help you measure this impact across two different stages. The first is preparing you for the impact. That is, seeing which users will be impacted before making a change that will, to determine if the change is actually feasible in the first place. And on the second phase, it's measuring the effect of that UI change after deployment to confirm whether your pre-deployment theory actually held up in reality. Now, some tangible metrics that you can use for such measurement include, for example, the adoption rate. So with the adoption rate for, let's say you wrapped up a build that includes some UI changes or new functionality or whatever, and you threw it out there. Now, this build that incorporates your changes, this will be your baseline indicating the portion of users that now have access to your latest UI. So having the adoption, being able to measure the adoption rate and knowing how many people adopted this new version that has these changes will be your baseline on which to build whether this was successful or not. Another metric is the first discovery. So when you're looking at how many people actually use the new UI or functionality, the one that you just deployed, that you are testing, this will give you the ability to measure how well you positioned this functionality in your product, and whether their interest in trying out this functionality is actually a good one. So kind of, you throw the product out there, now you know how many people have adopted that product or that version or that build. You see how many people have discovered those changes or tried it once, and then after that's done, you can check out, monitor the usage frequency of that build or that functionality to see those people that discovered this feature, how long they actually engaged with it. For example, did they use it once and immediately go back to their old ways of doing things, or did it stick and they started using this new workflow or this new UI component more frequently? This gives you an indication of whether people actually like what they see or what you've built, and whether it fits within their workflow. Now, once you adopt a usage intelligence solution, you can track these metrics in real time across the various builds. So the real-time element itself will be crucial if you want to run, for example, A/B tests to determine the best option going forward. You can then use also these metrics to justify your decision with management. So, hey, this is the reason we are going with this UI, with a button UI and not a menu UI, for example. And you can later also use this data to build adoption and promotion campaigns when you're planning to release the product, because you know how people behaved, you know how people reacted to your change, and you can use it when promoting your product, because people like this area, but they did not like that area, for example. Now, whether this is a product, whether it's a feature, or whether it's a UI component, in reality, in order to retain customer loyalty and also to retain your competitive advantage, you need to have the ability to deploy a change, measure users' reaction to that change, fix whatever doesn't work, and reiterate. And you have to be able to do this in the shortest possible interval. Sometimes it's impossible to predict how users will react to a feature or a UI change, right? So the best way of going about it would be to build a basic prototype or basic version of a feature. And to test your idea, you can use A/B testing, throw different versions out there. And when you want to refine that particular functionality, you look at the results from the A/B tests, right? Or the one that sticks kind of would be the one that you can adopt going forward. Now, A/B testing can be quite a headache unless you have a good way of monitoring what's exactly happening. If you do it totally manually, which in my previous roles, we did A/B tests manually. We did A/B tests that were automated. We tried to use collection. Definitely by far, having automated metric collection within the product will help you take the decision much, much faster. So, for example, in this particular graphic report here, we can see very clearly that 97% or so of our customers prefer printing from the UI button and not from the menu. Okay, so this product had two ways of accessing the print functionality, and we can very clearly see, and this can be within literally a few days of deployment, we can literally see that nobody wants to use, or well, very few people want to use the menu facility when doing their print options. So in this case, we can also see that for people who actually did print something from the menu, they only did it very few times. So in compared to the button clicks, they only printed between 1 and 20 documents from the menu. So it can be a safe bet in this case to pull out the menu option and simplify the UI. And usage intelligence in this case gives you the benefit of rapid prototyping, because when you get usage metrics immediately after deployment, you can apply the modifications much faster into your next iteration. For those of you relying on agile methodologies, for example, this ability for fast iterations will tie in very well with that, because you deploy literally within a week or two, you have all the results that you want to be able to build it into your next iteration. So now that we have seen a few cases, like a few examples, let's mention something about how qualitative feedback can be tied in with quantitative feedback. So as a user experience person, you typically anticipate or try to anticipate the flow that users will take through your application. And using your user interface design, you will try to push people into that flow, right? Lead them in the right direction, as we mentioned earlier. Now, whether people manage to flow through it without any issues is what you can find out via usage intelligence. Having access to quantitative data, such as collecting automated usage metrics and other metrics related to user behavior, will point you in the right direction as to what is resonating with your customers and what is not. However, at some point, you might still need to use enough feedback collection to validate the reasons why people have broken the flow or not reached an area of your software. And this is usually best achieved via one-to-one feedback, right? A number of you, I don't know the metric, but a number of you said you already consult with a sample set of customers when trying to decide what should go into the product or what a UI change should be about. So in this case, it's important to talk to our customers, but which is the sample of customers that you need to talk to? Who is going to offer the best feedback? Obviously, if you have thousands of customers, it's almost impossible to go after each and every one of them unless you throw out a mass survey and hope and cross your fingers that you get more than 5% response rate, right? So one of the most efficient ways to collect feedback from users is to do it in a semi-automated fashion by using targeted in-app messaging. So with usage intelligence data, keep in mind that you already have enough knowledge about your users that you can target them specifically based on their usage of the product. So for example, let's say you introduce new functionality or change the user experience around the feature, and you monitor your customers. You see customers that have used that feature, others that have not, or whatever, or have dropped through the flow. And with the information you have from usage intelligence, you can target those users who have used it, for example, once only, and ask them to rate what they think about this change, for example. On the other hand, if there are a portion of your audience who never make use of this new feature or UI change or whatever, then you can either send them in-app messages to educate them. Hey, did you know that this feature exists? Did you know, did you try it yet? Or here's a how-to video on how to use this new functionality or this new web interface or whatever. And or else you can also ask them, hey, why is it that you have not used it? Is it because you don't know about it, you've never heard of it, or is it because you tried to use it and it didn't meet your needs? So here you can see the power of having automated in-app intelligence that is being collected from your user base, and then using that intelligence to target your audience. So instead of sending, let's say you have 1,000 customers, right, who are using this latest build, instead of sending a survey or whatever, ask a question to all the 1,000 customers in the same way, you can split your audience in 3. Right? The first would be people who have used this functionality intensively. And you can ask them, hey, how can we make it better? It seems that you've become an expert at using this. Tell us, give us some feedback. On the other hand, people who have never used that functionality, you can ask them, hey, why is it that you didn't use it? Did you not hear about it, etc., or try and educate them. The third segment, in this case, can be people who used it maybe once or twice and did not use it anymore. In this case, that can be an indicator as to, hey, people know about it, they have tried it, but it seems there's some problem, they're not using it as much as the rest of the people. So this might be a good sample set to ask the question, hey, what's wrong with our feature? Kind of, why did it not meet your needs? Why have you stopped using it? So, instead of sending a single survey that would be considered noise to some people because it's useless asking them how can we improve it if they have never even seen it, you can split your audience, segment it, and send more targeted feedback like surveys or pop-ups on the screen or whatever that is powered by the usage intelligence data that you have collected. Now, before we go to my conclusion, I wanted to show you a particular use case from a client. Now, this is a particular client that's in the CAD/CAM space, right? And one thing that the client had in mind is obviously that improvements can be validated by monitoring the user behavior. But to throw something out there and monitor this behavior, if you make a mistake, a silly mistake, and people don't like it, it can be a very, very expensive thing once it's already deployed. So taking the right decisions for this particular company and most companies can take quite some time. And what this company tried to do is to eliminate any negative impact by studying their user base before they do the deployment. So this particular software, it's a very expensive piece of software. It's in the CAD/CAM manufacturing space. They have thousands of customers and companies relying on that. The software is 10 years old, so it's proven and people are using it for their workflows. And it's also, over the time, it's also become very complex. It contains like 1,200 different functionalities. Now, the software itself has been using the same menu-driven user interface for the past 10 years. And there are several thousand people relying heavily on this particular interface. Now, last year, the company was at a crossroad. Before adding any more functionality and complicating the software even further, they wanted to simplify the UI with all of its 1,200 features. Because obviously there are different people using different features, so they couldn't pull anything out. And they wanted to do this without breaking the workflow for any of their customers. So what they did is, after analyzing what function groups their customers were using and in what order, they actually settled for a UI that was based on a Microsoft-style ribbon interface. So they decided to change from a menu-based UI to a ribbon interface. Now, the daunting task was to determine which of the 1,200 functionalities could be grouped up together, which should be eliminated from the new UI. So over the course of a whole year, they used usage analytics to study in detail usage behavior from the different user segments. And what they've done is they actually deployed a single version of their software with a totally new user interface. They estimated actually that without usage analytics, it would have taken them around 36 months to survey all their users and stagger the changes over several releases, because they did one major release per year, right? So they would have had to stagger the changes over 3 different releases, which they avoided by using usage analytics, because they could move way faster without making any mistakes, since all the changes were based on accurate usage data from observing the customers, or all of their customers, and not just a sample interview of sample customers that were interviewed. So although the example I talked about here involves a multi-million-dollar company, with a large complex product, the same points would apply to smaller companies and smaller products. So it's very important that you observe your users before making any decisions. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. We're now going to open up the webinar for questions. I'm not sure if any of you have already typed in questions, but feel free to send us your questions, and I'll try and reply as much as possible until the end of the hour. So, David?
Very good. Thank you, Keith. All right. So a couple of questions. I guess based off of the case study that you shared, I was wondering if you could talk more about predicting the impact of changes on your biggest customers, and how do you do that with analysis?
Okay, well, first, before you can actually predict the impact, you need to identify who your biggest customers are. Right now, you can identify them because they're the highest paying customers or the biggest in terms of the number of seats deployed. You can do this in 2 ways. Most of our customers actually do this anonymously, because you can look at the type of license that is being used, for example, or the edition that they're running. For example, a home user versus an enterprise user. An enterprise user is typically a bigger and higher paying customer than a home user. So you can do that. You can identify users by doing that anonymously. Or else you can also be non-anonymous and identify the actual users by their license key or company name or username or whatever. Obviously, this will give you much more accurate usage statistics that can be applied to a customer, but of course, this might have some privacy implications. So you need to cater for this inside your EULA or by notifying users. Now, once you have identified customers, then you need to run reports filtered to show only that segment of users. So once you have the users filtered out, then it's really easy to look at their current workflows, right? Because you can see the usage patterns and to see if your changes will be interrupting or else enhancing those specific flows of those users. So if you split it into it, the first task is identifying who the users are and making sure you have a way to identify who the highest paying user is or the largest customer, and this based on the question. And this second is analyzing usage behavior based on only those users. Now, if you want to take it a step further, you can also validate your ideas by reaching out to them via a survey, like we mentioned before in the quantitative versus qualitative, right? So you can gather feedback on what they think of your improvement or change before you actually roll it out to a mass audience. Okay. Yep, so do you have any other questions, David?
Yep, very good. I just want to remind people that now is the time to type in a question in your control panel and send it along, and again we'll get to as many as time allows. Okay, so getting back to it now, we have a question. You mentioned in-app surveys. This person may have missed how you present them only to the most relevant users.
Okay, so the most relevant user, I mean, first of all, who is the most relevant user, right? So this depends on the case that the this particular person is trying to cover. But for example, let's say you're trying to run a survey about people using a feature. Now, if you want to ask about how people like a feature or whether they actually like a feature, then you should set the in-app campaign filters to target only those users who have used the feature, say, at least 10 times since installing your software. So in this case, the most relevant user is a user that used the feature, 5, 10, 20 times, because you're going to be asking them how they like it, etc. If, on the other hand, you want to learn why people are not using a particular functionality, then in this case, the most relevant user is the one that has never accessed this functionality, right? So in this case, you set a filter when you're sending in-app messages or whatever that will, you can do this via their license key, obviously, because you want to ask only people who do have access to this feature but have decided not to use it. So for example, you can say filter by a license type that includes this feature, and then filter by the usage of that feature. So if the user's usage is 0 or very few times, then you can ask this particular question as to why you are not using it. Of course, to be able to do this, you need to have a usage intelligence solution that can track this activity. But if you are after people who will be affected by, for example, a UI change related to, for example, you're changing the monitor resolution, then you need to target users having that particular monitor or resolution configuration. So, the most relevant user depends on what is the question or what it is that you're trying to learn from those users.
Okay, we got an interesting follow-up question to that, and that is, if you're only tracking a portion of your users, how do you know that you have enough data to make a safe decision?
Okay, well, that's quite a good point. It is very common, actually, that you do not have complete data, right? If we had complete data about everything, answering all our questions, both product management and the developers would have a way easier life. So in this case where you don't have complete data, what you need to keep in mind is that usage data from a sample of users is way better than no data at all. Okay, so of course, if you have 10,000 customers but you only have data on 5 customers, then I would say you need to find other sources of information to back up your claims or to back up your plan before you move forward, right? But as your sample set starts growing, at some point it becomes statistically irrelevant to collect data from all users, since the margin of error will shift very, very slowly as you grow. Now, if you are about to take a very drastic decision that can have a negative impact, then you should do a more elaborate what-if analysis in-house, for example, before you actually look at the data. So you do a what-if analysis, and since you have limited data or limited sample, you get the results of that what-if analysis and then try to validate that analysis by looking at your existing sample set. So, in this case, you can also look at the past trends in your data, showing how people reacted to similar changes you've made in the past. So if you're missing data right now, you can look at trends, look at historical decisions that were somewhat similar. And if that's not available, if you have nothing available at some point, yes, you might still need to pull in your gut instinct based on your experience. Maybe the way of doing this in the case where you have close to zero data would be to minimize the risk and take it in smaller steps and monitor the results along the way. So you, instead of making one huge drastic UI change, you split the change in various steps, monitor how people react to the smaller steps, and that way you would be minimizing your risk.
Very good. Okay, we'll take one final question before we come back to you for your final thoughts. And one of our attendees wants to know, where are you from, Keith? You have an interesting accent.
Well, I get asked that quite frequently, actually. I'm from Malta. I'm a native from Malta, which is a tiny island in the Mediterranean. And we're influenced by Italians, French, English, etc. So that's probably where the interesting accent comes along.
That's great. Thanks for that. Okay, so we're coming up on time, so just wanted to kind of throw it back to you if there's one. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure.
There was one other question that just snuck in under the wire. So someone wants to know, isn't there a UX design pattern, proven design that works?
Well, I mean, a pattern that works across all industries, across all different software types, etc. I mean, if there is a single one that works all the time, I don't know about it. I mean, most of the different UX design methodologies, and as well as software development methodologies, they encapsulate a lot of common traits, right? So it's always about, if it's UI or UX design, it's always about keeping in mind what your customer is trying to do, keeping in mind that you need to help your customer focus. And I think all methodologies or all techniques in UI design are put a crucial emphasis on the fact that you need to be as simple as possible when people are looking at what they're trying to do with your software or with whatever interface you're building. So although there is no single UI design methodology that works all the time, most of the different methodologies, I mean, there are people who prefer putting stuff on paper, there are people who prefer a lot of A/B testing, there are people who prefer throwing stuff out there and teaching people how to fit in that within that workflow. Typically, you find the larger customers that would do this, like the Salesforce type, right? They do studies, but then they throw it out there and force everyone to start adopting that. Microsoft Office is a case in point, for example. A lot of people get irritated when Microsoft change stuff around, but in the end, everybody gets used to it. And the same thing goes with Gmail and Google and whatever. So there are various ways of going about it. I don't think there is a single preference or single way that everybody should follow, as long as the basic criteria are kept in consideration.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. I know for a fact that when Microsoft was creating SharePoint and running it over the years, they didn't want people customizing the interface, and yet people hated the way it looked. But Microsoft's rule was you can't change it from what it is. So, they were trying to make it easy for everybody using it to standardize, but it turned out that users were not really enjoying the interface at all. So
yeah,
sometimes
exactly.
I guess setting a rule can be counterproductive.
Exactly. I mean, forcing people to what you believe is the right way of doing things will definitely be stepping on a lot of toes. I mean, you mentioned SharePoint, which is probably one of the most biggest nightmares of new users trying to get used to a new interface, right? It's like
Exactly.
a whole journey to try and find what you're trying to do. But obviously, it's a complex software. But there are various other softwares which are as complex, which have done a great job at guiding the user and splitting the persona, the segment. With SharePoint, it has 2 million functionalities, but I might only need 20 of them. So why should I be, looking at all the 2 million different functionalities that an enterprise customer might want and I don't need? So that's something to always keep in mind, is what is your customer trying to do with your software?
Right. Excellent. Okay, Keith, so I'm going to throw it back to you right now for perhaps 60 seconds or so of a final takeaway for our attendees. If there's one thought that you would leave them with for the afternoon, what would that be?
Yeah, well, I come from a background of data and big data analysis. So one thing I always like to tell customers or people or companies we're mentoring is data can make your life much, much easier. Now, there's a very distinct borderline between data and noise, right? So be careful that when whatever solutions you're trying to use to beef up your decisions with data give you actionable information. They don't fill up your database with noise that you cannot consume. So whatever you're trying to do, always rely and back up your decisions with data, because data is the only way to get a reality check of what the facts look out there. But on the same time, be careful not to indulge yourself into two-way complex, like analyzing data that never ends. So make sure that whatever solution you build or solution you use to collect this data gives you immediate actionable results.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you for a great presentation, Keith Fenech, Vice President of Software Analytics for Revulytics. And I'd like to thank Revulytics for sponsoring today's webinar. And I would like to thank our attendees for hanging in there for this 50 minutes or so for a very interesting discussion. Until next time, I'm Dave Rubenstein, editor-in-chief of SD Times. So long for now.